Some say the river still remembers. The Tiber, flowing quietly beneath the veil of night, carries with it stories older than stone. On certain evenings, if you sit by its edge where the reeds kiss the wind, and the moonlight brushes the water like a memory, you might hear murmur the sound of two infant cries, long faded, but never forgotten. They speak of a she-wolf, her fur glistening with morning dew, standing over a cradle woven from reeds and fate. She doesn't snarl, she does not bite, she nurses, and in doing so, she becomes the first mother of a city not yet born. Romulus and Remus, eyes wide with hunger and the silence of exile, feed from that wild kindness, before temples, before legions, before empire and echo. There were only two brothers, a river, and the breath of myth floating through an ancient Italian dusk. They say the stars watched as Romulus took up the plow to mark his city's edge, a line in the dust no one should cross, but Remus did. And with one motion, perhaps in rage, perhaps in sorrow, the dream of brotherhood cracked, and the soil drank its first Roman blood. This was how Rome began, not with parchment or peace, but with the ache of love turned to law. The gods of those early days were not distant. They lived in trees, in winds, in doorways and fields. Janus with his twin faces watched both ends of every beginning. Vesta flickered in hearths where mothers whispered songs to children who would one day die in wars. Each thunderclap was Jupiter's reminder, each harvest a nod from Ceres. The world was alive, breathing in the rhythms of the old hills, and Rome grew not from conquest, but from ritual, from augurs tracing the flight of birds in morning skies to the salt sprinkled on newborn brows. Everything was sacred, everything mattered. The laurel, worn not yet as imperial crown, but as a modest wreath of honor, rustled in breezes that smelled of smoke, soil, and sun-warmed stone. Somewhere in the hush of those first years, fire was kindled that would never fully die. Not the fire of war, though that would come in abundance, but a quieter flame. The fire of continuity, of myth turned to structure, of dream given muscle and wall. Elders sat on simple wooden benches, not yet calling themselves senators, but already debating the weight of justice in the tone of grain measures and the rights of sons over their father's land. It was a slow beginning. Rome was not forged in an hour, nor in glory. It emerged like mist from a valley, one hut at a time, one oath at a time. Neighbors became citizens, citizens became soldiers, and soldiers returned not just with scars, but with stories that shaped what it meant to belong. In every child's lullaby, sung over smoky lamps and the scent of crushed herbs, there was a trace of something larger than survival, a promise that this city, muddy and rough, still learning how to build and how to bury, was destined for more. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the Palatine, people gathered to tell tales that blurred the line between history and hope. They told of Aeneas, the Trojan who wandered from fire and ruin across the sea to plant his lineage in Italian soil. They spoke of Alba Longa, of kings with silver hair and mysterious births, of omens etched in the flight of eagles or the sudden bloom of roses in winter. These stories wrapped Rome in a cloak of destiny, even while its streets were little more than paths beaten down by sandals and livestock. Rome was a child in those years, wide-eyed and restless, not yet fearing the weight of its own name. Its hands were still learning the craft of civilization, and his breath still trembled with the poetry of beginnings. Each household was a world, each altar a bridge between earth and the divine. Life was close to the elements, water drawn from springs, bread kneaded with ash-dusted fingers, oil lamps flickering as shadows danced against bare walls. The sound of hammers echoed softly in the morning, shaping tools and hope in equal measure. The city didn't yet call itself eternal. It did not yet dream of emperors or amphitheaters or distant frontiers lined with marching legions. It was small, but like all small things, it held the seed of enormity. The gods seemed closer then, as though walking unseen through groves and markets, pausing beside sleeping infants and quiet fires. Women wore simple tunics and silver pins in their hair. Men leaned on staffs worn smooth by long days in the fields. Time moved differently, not yet counted in consular years or imperial edicts, but in harvests and the silence between seasons. And when the winds shifted just right, carrying with them the scent of laurel and wood smoke, one could almost hear a whisper, not a prophecy, exactly, but a question. What will this place become? It was a place of beginnings, the kind that sleep beneath the surface of memory, too deep for words, too ancient for doubt. Rome was still soft, still green, still dreaming beside its river, and as night blanketed the hills and stars blinked like distant embers, the city that would one day call itself the heart of an empire curled inward, like a child in sleep, cradled by myth and warmed by the breath of wolves. Long before marble steps echoed with the march of senators, and long before the clang of swords rang through the empire's furthest frontiers, there were the hills, 7 of them, cradling a quiet stretch of the Tiber, each rising with the unhurried grace of time itself. They were not marked on maps, not yet, for no cartographer had reason to note the silence of sheep or the call of herdsmen as dawn melted the mist. The Aventine, the Palatine, the Caelian, their names would come later, whispered with reverence, but in those early centuries, they were simply earth, ancient and alive, holding secrets beneath their soil. The shepherds who lived there did not yet speak of Rome, but they moved through the rhythms of a life that was close to the bone. Their homes were not of marble, but of woven branches, dried mud, and straw roofs that hissed gently in the rain. At night, they lay on rough wool blankets and listened to the river breathing below, wondering perhaps if the stars had names, or if the wind carried messages from the gods. Days were slow, men woke with the birds, scratched their beards, and stepped barefoot into the cool grass. Their hands were strong, not from war but from work-mending tools, shaping wood, guiding plows pulled by oxen who had names and moods. Women rose early too, lighting the hearth, grinding grain with rhythm steady as the heart, and humming tunes that had no beginning and no end. Children chased each other between goats and fig trees, calling out names in a language that would one day shape laws, poetry, and prayers. It was not a city yet. It was a village, and even calling it that feels too grand. It was a gathering, a loose communion of lives woven together by necessity, blood, and proximity. Disputes were settled not in courts, but beneath olive trees, with gruff voices and firm handshakes. There was no senate to argue, no legions to defend, but there was order, of a sort an order found in routine, in the knowing glance between neighbors, in the way one elder's opinion carried more weight because his hands trembled a little when he reached for bread. They believed in gods, of course, not the distant thunderous ones who would one day command temples and festivals, but smaller spirits, lairs and penates, the ones who guarded the home, the hearth, the cupboard where salted fish was stored. Offerings were modest: a cup of wine, a loaf of bread, a whispered word of thanks. The people did not need grand rituals to feel the sacred. It was in the warmth of fire, in the turning of the seasons, in the first cry of a newborn beneath a straw roof. The hills gave them shelter, the river gave them water, and slowly, without fanfare, the space between huts grew smaller. Paths became foot-worn trails, trails became roads, and before anyone declared it, a city had begun to stir. It didn't rise like a monument, but unfolded like a story, one told softly, line by line. The marketplace came first, just a clearing where goods were traded, but it was enough. Fish from the river, cheese wrapped in fig leaves, wool dyed in shades of ochre and umber. There was laughter there, an argument, and the smell of garlic and oil. Then came the wall, not the grand fortifications of later years, but a simple line of stones meant to mark what belonged to them. Not to keep others out, not yet, but to say this is where our lives begin. And with each passing year, the city grew not only in size, but in spirit. It was becoming something more than huts and firelight. It was becoming Rome. But even as the streets widened and the rooftops multiplied, the soul of those early days remained close to the earth. In the evenings, when the sun slipped behind the hills and the cicadas began their song, people still sat on thresholds, speaking in low voices about rain, crops, and dreams. The scent of roasting lentils drifted through the air. Children listened, half asleep, as grandparents spoke of omens seen in bird flight or of a wolf's cry heard in the distance. Stories passed down like heirlooms, carried in breath and silence. And though no one knew what future would grow from these hills, some sensed it in the way the air felt heavy with potential, in the way strangers from farther lands began to arrive, bringing words and goods and questions. The people who lived there began to see themselves not just as villagers, but as part of something unfolding. Their language sharpened, their customs deepened. They began to organize, to plan, to believe that what they built might last, and the gods seemed to nod in approval. The flames burned steady in the hearths. The rains came when needed. The soil gave what was asked. Rome was still small, still vulnerable, but it was rooted not just in geography, but in memory. And that memory, though unrecorded, lived in every gesture, every path walked barefoot in the morning dew. Time passed like a slow wind, unnoticed but always there. New generations were born who had never known anything else to them. The city had always existed, always thrived. They did not remember the days of only hills and herds, only whispered fires in the dark, but the hills remembered, the stones beneath their feet remembered. And when the stars came out, glittering above rooftops that leaned toward one another like old friends, a quiet wonder hung in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath, watching something miraculous slowly come to be. In the early hush of morning, before the first shout in the marketplace, and before the smoke of breakfast fires curled upward into the pale Roman sky, the city yawned and stretched in silence. The houses were humble then, more earth than ambition, more necessity than grandeur. Walls of clay and straw, packed tightly by calloused hands, formed small huts that huddled together like siblings against the chill. Thatched roofs, heavy with dew, dripped gently onto packed dirt floors, and within these spaces, life unfolded with the quiet rhythm of routine. Men stirred first, wrapping rough wool cloaks around their shoulders, stepping out into the dim light to tend animals or check traps. Their eyes were still heavy with dreams, and their thoughts, though simple, often brushed unknowingly against the bones of destiny. Women rose not long after, kneading bread with practiced strength, their fingers dusted with flour as if marked by the gods of nourishment. The smell of baking dough, mingled with the tang of morning air, drifted through the alleys and lingered in the spaces between homes, soft as memory. Children's laughter, sharp and bright, echoed like flutes as they chased chickens or pretended to be warriors with sticks. Yet, beneath this humble surface, something stirred, not rebellion, not conquest, but a longing. It lived in the way stones were placed, a little straighter this time, a little firmer. It lived in the way fires were tended, not just to cook, but to last. This was the dream not yet of empire, but of permanence. The early Romans were not yet Romans as we would know them. They were builders, tinkerers, farmers, and worshippers, moving through each day with a patient kind of defiance. They built with whatever the land offered, but their vision reached farther than their tools could grasp. Mud walls gave way to sun-dried bricks, and soon stone was introduced, not in palaces, but in foundations, in thresholds, in the quiet determination to make something that would outlast the man who placed it. Streets began to take shape, not just as paths worn down by sandals, but as intentions. There were no grand designs yet, no architects with scrolls of schematics, but there was instinct. The instinct to gather, to create a center, to define a home. The form was born from this, a simple square at first, a place to trade, to talk, to wait, a wooden bench here, a shaded stall there, and slowly, almost shyly, public life began. Disputes once settled with gruff nods now sought the opinions of elders who gathered under olive trees with furrowed brows. Laws, though unwritten, began to take shape in common memory. Don't steal, don't lie, don't harm your neighbor's flock. They were rules as old as community, as natural as breath. Temples, too, found their place, though they were modest shrines more than sanctuaries, open to the sky and fragrant with herbs. Offerings were left on flat stones, grain, oil, a strand of woven wool. The gods were never far. They watched from doorways, from tree branches, from the eyes of passing animals. Each home had its household spirits, its little rituals, its morning murmur of prayers. And though the city was still poor, still small, it was rich with these invisible threads that stitched each life into the next. Romans believed in ancestors, not just those buried under stones, but those who walked beside them, unseen but present. At night, when lamps flickered and silence settled over the clay walls, people whispered stories of their forebears, of struggles survived and wisdom passed down like heirlooms. In this way, time stretched backward as much as forward, and each hut, no matter how crude, became a part of something larger. The hills, too, began to change. No longer just wild crests where sheep grazed. They now held meaning, names, identity. The Palatine rose as the heart of the growing city, its slopes dotted with stronger homes, with watch posts, with the quiet vigilance of a people just beginning to understand their place. The Aventine stood apart, a bit more distant, sometimes seen as the hill of outsiders, a foreshadowing of divisions to come. But for now, the hills held together, like fingers curled into a fist not yet clenched. Craftsmen emerged from the simplicity. Potters shaped vessels with care, their thumbs leaving small marks at the base like signatures. Weavers dyed cloth with crushed berries and bitter roots, their colors humble but lasting. Smiths hammered tools and hinges from soft metal, their rhythm marking time in each neighborhood. The city began to speak through its objects not in Latin yet, but in form and function. And with each passing season, Rome became less of a place you stumbled into and more of a place you sought. Travelers arrived, sometimes by accident, sometimes by curiosity, and they found more than huts. They found order. They found a people who welcomed strangers with guarded warmth and measured words. They found something taking shape beneath the ordinary, a rhythm, a will, a murmur of something unbreakable. The dream of stone came slowly. The idea that clay walls would not suffice forever. That something needed to be built which could bear the weight of weather, the weight of generations, the weight of memory. And so they built, not yet the aqueducts, not yet the colosseums, but small bridges, thicker columns, sturdier corners, a well dug deeper, a gate reinforced. The dream was not glory. It was survival, carved into permanence. The rains came, and the streets held. The winds howled, and the walls did not fall. And each time that happened, the people of Rome looked at their city with quiet pride, knowing that something in the clay was becoming eternal. Long before the emperors cloaked themselves in purple and declared dominion over oceans and deserts, there were kings not in the image of tyrants or distant autocrats, but as guardians of an emerging flame. In those earliest chapters, Rome did not yet wear a crown of conquest, but rather a wreath of survival. The kings were few 7, if the old tales are to be trusted, and each one etched a line in the foundation of a city still soft around the edges, still tasting of earth and smoke. Romulus, the first, loomed like a ghost over every hilltop. He was more myth than man by the time people whispered his name at night, and yet they believed that he called upon gods with hands stained in his brother's blood, that he shaped laws from silence, and summoned people from shadow to stand as Romans. Under him, the walls of Rome were raised not merely as barriers, but as a circle of belonging. He vanished, they say, not in death, but in storm taken by the divine amid a thunderclap. As if the gods, too, needed a founder. After him came Numa, who replaced the sword with stillness. Where Romulus built, Numa prayed. He whispered with Vestal virgins and marked the calendar with sacred days. He taught Rome how to listen to omens, to the seasons, to the pulse of the sacred in everyday dust. He brought temples where once there had been only open sky. He calmed the restless fire and shaped it into ritual. And though there were no armies under his reign, his legacy lingered like incense, curling through generations. Each king that followed bore a different gift. Some brought fire like Tullus Hostilius, whose voice roared louder than thunder. Under him, Rome tasted war not as desperation, but as art. The battle with Alba Longa, that distant cousin of Roman blood, ended not in destruction, but in absorption. Rome grew, Rome fed, Rome stretched her limbs a little wider. Then came Ancus Marcius, who looked to the river and dreamed of bridges. He reached outward, toward trade, toward salt roads, toward the sea. Under him, the port of Ostia was born, a gateway to the tides that would one day carry Roman ships to every shore. Each of these kings wove threads into Rome's cloak war: peace, faith, trade, and the cloth thickened. The people did not elect them, not in the modern sense, but neither were they wholly imposed. They were chosen, in a way, through signs, omens, lineage, and approval of the elders. Their power was not absolute, yet it was immense. They judged disputes, offered sacrifices, commanded troops, and kept the sacred flame of continuity alight. Then came kings not born of Rome, but of elsewhere. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, an Etruscan by blood, brought with him a richness unfamiliar to the Roman eye: arches, games, marble dreams. Under him, the Circus Maximus took shape, not yet as the roaring colossus of later years, but as a dusty oval where horses raced and people forgot their hunger. He adorned the city with symbols of power, with stone teeth that bit into the earth. Holding buildings upright, Servius Tullius followed, once a servant, perhaps a miracle child with fire in his hair. He drew the first census, not merely counting lives, but dividing them, organizing them, giving Rome a skeleton upon which to grow. He built walls broader and stronger, wrapping the city in security and in promise. But the flame flickered when Tarquinius Superbus came, the proud, the final king. His reign, wrapped in cruelty and ambition, pushed Rome past reverence into resentment. He did not ask, he demanded. He did not rule, he grasped. The people, once respectful of their kings, began to whisper in corners. It was not a single act, they say, but a slow gathering of shadows. The breaking point came not with policy or tax, but with a woman's cry. Lucretia, her name now heavy with mourning, violated by the king's son, chose death over dishonor. Her blood, more than any decree, called the people to rise. In that moment, the idea of kingship died in Roman hearts. The city, still young, still learning, opened its eyes to something new. The monarchy ended not with swords, but with refusal. No more kings, they said. And so the fire passed into different hands. But though the kings were gone, their fingerprints remained. The rituals they shaped continued. The temples they raised stood firm. The streets they laid were still walked by generations who no longer spoke their names aloud, but who could not escape their shadows. Rome was shaped by them not just in stone, but in soul. Each king, for all his flaws or virtues, had carried a portion of the city's burden across a treacherous bridge from myth to reality. What they ruled was not an empire, nor a republic, but a chrysalis. And though the monarchs fell, what they built did not. It endured, slipping into the bones of Rome, into the ways people greeted each other, the rhythms of festivals, the weight of law. The kings had carried the flame as far as they could. Now it would pass to the people, or at least to those who would speak in their name. And as the sun set on the age of kings, casting long golden shadows over rooftops of clay and stone, the city exhaled. It was not a shout of revolution, but a quiet shift, a turning of the earth, a new breath before dawn. The kings were gone, but Rome remained. It did not arrive with fanfare or banners. This thing they would call a republic. No trumpet announced its birth. No poet carved its name into marble the morning it stirred. It came slowly, like mist rising from warm earth after rain, unnoticed at first, then undeniable. One by one, voices began to shift, not in rebellion, but in redefinition. The kings had been cast out, and in the silence that followed, the people looked at one another with the fragile curiosity of those no longer ruled. And so they began to speak not with certainty, but with necessity. They did not yet know what a republic should be. They only knew what it must never again become. No more crowns, no more thrones, no more sons of kings who mistook power for birthright. And from that shared refusal came structure, tentative at first, like a child learning to stand. 2 consuls, not one king, a balance of voices, elected by the people, serving for a single year. They stood not above the law, but within it, a symbol of restraint dressed in authority. Around them, the Senate took root, not in grandeur, but in memory. Elders once trusted with counsel, now given a voice in governance. These were not aristocrats by gold, but by age, by land, by the quiet accumulation of influence. The Senate spoke slowly, gravely, as if every word carried the weight of generations, and beneath them, the people, the plebs, farmers, tradesmen, soldiers, sons of no one and everyone. Their power came not from scrolls or titles, but from numbers and from need. They were the breath of the Republic, restless, rough, essential. At first, their voices were barely heard. The patricians, those noble families who traced their bloodlines to the dawn of the city, guarded power like fire. But the plebeians pushed, not with weapons, but with presence. They withdrew from the city once, in protest, leaving the elite to govern empty streets and hungry markets. And it worked. The tribunes were born protectors of the people, armed with the sacred right to veto, to say no, to hold back the tide of abuse. Each small shift, each law, each custom became a step. The 12 tables, etched in bronze, marked another milestone. For the first time, laws were not hidden in the minds of priests or whispered in noble halls. They were public, visible, imperfect, yes, but real. In the forum, children read them aloud. Farmers memorized them, merchants measured deals against them, and in doing so, Rome began to see itself not as a collection of tribes or families, but as a single body. A res publica, the public thing, the shared thing, the thing that belonged to all. Still, it was not smooth. Factions grew. Patricians and plebeians clashed in the Senate, in the streets, in the stories passed down around evening fires. Reforms came, were resisted, returned again. Land rights, debts, military service, who could vote, who could marry, who could lead. The Republic was not a finished idea. It was a constant negotiation, and yet through it all, Rome endured. More than that, it matured. Institutions thickened like old vines, winding through the city's heart. The curule chair, a seat of honor. The lictors with their bundles of rods, symbols of authority. The assemblies, where votes were cast with pebbles and decisions swayed with speeches. Orators emerged, men with thunder in their voices and honey in their words. They stood beneath the open sky and wove arguments from reason and passion, winning the crowd not with promises, but with persuasion. And still, outside the city, Rome watched the horizon. It was not yet an empire, but it was no longer a village. The Republic, so young and so fragile, began to extend itself. First to neighbors, the Latins, the Sabines bound by treaties, often shaken by betrayal. Then to enemies, Veii, Etruscan cities, sieges that lasted years, fought with the patience of stone. Each victory brought more than land. It brought questions. Who could be a citizen who had a voice with each conquest? Rome had to redefine itself, to include or to exclude, to absorb or to resist. And always, there was the army, not yet professional, not yet a career, but a duty. Citizens took up arms in times of need, returning to their fields when the war was done. They carried plows and swords with equal familiarity. Their shields bore the name of Rome, but their hands were still calloused from wheat. Discipline was everything, not ferocity, not glory, but formation. Rows of men, trained to hold the line, to move as one. Victory came not from chaos, but from control. Generals earned their triumphs not in single acts of courage, but in campaigns that bent time and geography. As the Republic grew, so too did its stories. Cincinnatus, the farmer called from his plow to lead the army, who returned to his field when duty was done, a symbol not of power, but of restraint to the ideal Roman citizen, choosing humility over rule. These were the tales whispered into young ears. Shaping the citizen soul, Rome was still poor in many ways. The homes were modest, the streets uneven, the baths rare, but it was rich in order, in ritual, in structure. From the auspices bird flights read before every public act to the clang of the Comitium bell, the city moved with a sacred rhythm. It was becoming more than a place. It was becoming an idea, and that idea, though still unpolished, was powerful. That governance could belong not to kings, not to gods, but to men, to the people. It was fragile, yes, vulnerable to corruption, to ambition, to error, but it was also enduring, like fire sheltered beneath stone. A republic, kindled slowly, watching the skies, remembering the past, building towards something still unnamed. It began as footsteps on dirt roads, sandals worn thin by the weight of shields and the silence of resolve. The republic, once content with its hills and gods, began to step outward, not in arrogance at first, but in necessity. The neighboring tribes, once brothers in festival and rivalries in harvest, had grown restless, and Rome, ever alert, stood not with fear, but with formation. Soldiers marched not for gold, not yet, but because the Republic asked it. They were citizen farmers, men who laid aside their sickles when the horns called, and returned to their fields when the dust of battle cleared. With each campaign, the idea of Rome lengthened like a shadow at dusk. She didn't conquer all at once. She negotiated, then broke those negotiations. She offered alliance, then demanded tribute, and where resistance rose, the legions followed. These legions were not just lines of men, they were Rome's memory given muscle. Their formations were precise, almost sacred. Their camps laid out with mathematical serenity, a ditch, a rampart, a tent for each rank, order, always order, because Rome believed that chaos was the realm of barbarians. And in that belief, they forged both law and blade. When the Samnites defied her, Rome answered not with a single strike, but with years of pressure, adapting, learning from defeat. The Caudine Forks, a humiliation. Where Roman soldiers passed under the yoke in surrender did not crush the Republic. It refined her. Steel was tempered not in victory, but in shame. Rome returned, with strategy sharpened, with roads built across mountains, with alliances seeded like grain across the land. And the land, oh, how central the land was. Every battle was not merely for glory, but for fields, for acres that could be measured, plowed, taxed. Conquered soil became Roman soil, and with it came colonies, small outposts of Roman life, planted in foreign ground. Veterans settled there, bringing Latin tongues and Roman customs to hills that had never known such voices. They built temples, forums, wells. They married local women. They taught their children Roman law, and slowly, the borders blurred. What had been enemy became neighbor. What had been foreign became familiar. Rome did not only destroy, she absorbed. Cities that surrendered were given a taste of citizenship, rights measured in gradients, access to markets and protection. It was a system not of mercy, but of brilliance. Loyalty was bought not with coin, but with promise. And promise, under Rome, often looked like peace. The roads came next, paved with stone, carved across valleys and through forests with a relentless determination. They were arteries of ambition, allowing legions to move swiftly and merchants to follow. Along their edges rose taverns, shrines, mile markers, quiet symbols that this land, once wild, now bent to Roman rhythm. Yet, even as Rome extended her hand, she kept her sword sharp. The Etruscans were subdued. The Gauls, who once sacked the city and left her trembling, were pushed back. The wounds of that sack were never forgotten. The ashes of old temples reminded Romans that survival was never guaranteed. So they trained harder, drilled longer, built thicker walls. In their forums, speeches grew bolder. In their temples, sacrifices became more frequent. Mars, the god of war, was no longer just a name, he was a companion. Every shield bore his blessing. Every campaign was waged in his shadow. And all the while, the Republic grew not wildly, but deliberately. Each new province, each newly forged alliance, added to the complexity of governance. Magistrates were dispatched to distant lands, bringing Roman law to people who did not know Latin, who had never seen a toga. Mistakes were made. Corruption followed, but the machine continued, grinding forward. The Senate debated endlessly. Generals reported back with scrolls detailing victories and losses. Some returned to cheering crowds, to triumphs that wound through the city with elephants and incense and songs. Others returned quietly, with scars instead of glory. But each one added to the myth of inevitability, of Rome as destiny. Across the seas, Carthage watched, a city of merchants, rich in silver and ships. Carthage controlled trade routes and harbors with elegant ease. Rome, still young in comparison, began to see her as more than a neighbor. She was a mirror and a rival. Their eyes met across the water, and the world would never be the same. But before that war, before Hannibal and elephants, there was expansion, measured, steady, relentless. Rome expanded not because she lusted for empire, but because she feared its absence. To not grow was to invite danger. To not strike was to be struck. And so she expanded through treaties, through war, through roads and law and time. The Republic was not yet decadent. It was disciplined. It was still shaped by men who remembered hunger, who knew the weight of armor, who had felt the tremble of the earth beneath a marching army. The soil beneath their feet was no longer just home. It was foundation, and the steel they carried was no longer just for defense. It was purpose. Every morning, the city awoke to the clang of hammers, to the shuffle of sandals, to the quiet hum of a people who knew that they were not merely surviving, they were shaping something immense, not yet an empire, but no longer a village. Rome was stretching toward the horizon, and the world had begun to notice. It was not the sound of swords or the clatter of hooves that marked the beginning, but the whisper of trade winds over the Mediterranean, a quiet, eternal breath between two rising powers. Rome, with her new roads and swelling pride, cast her gaze across the blue, and there, shimmering in the heat beyond Sicily, stood Carthage, a city older than myth, born from Tyrian blood, her sails thick with spice and silver, her harbors fat with grain and ivory. Carthage did not march, she sailed. Her empire was not carved by legions, but strung together with contracts and coin. She was a spider of commerce, quiet and watchful, and for a while, Rome respected the distance, but Sicily changed everything. A rocky island with fertile plains and many masters, it became the spark in dry fields. Rome stepped onto Sicily not as invader, but as helper, so she claimed. But once her soldiers' sandals met that foreign soil, they did not retreat. Neither did the Carthaginians. And so the First Punic War began a slow, grinding affair not of glory but of endurance. Rome, new to naval combat, built fleets from scratch, copying Carthaginian ships plank by plank. But what Rome lacked in seaborne elegance, she made up for in will. She added the Corvus, an iron boarding ramp, a bridge of war. It turned sea battles into land battles, where Roman discipline prevailed. The war dragged on, years blurred, islands burned, men drowned with salt in their lungs. But eventually, Carthage yielded, not because she was weak, but because Rome had learned how to last. Sicily became the Republic's first overseas province, and with it came a new hunger. Yet peace would not hold. In Carthage, as reparations bled her treasury, a boy was growing. His name was Hannibal. He was raised not on lullabies, but on hatred taught by his father, Hamilcar, to never trust the Romans, to see in their smiles the curve of blades. And when Rome extended her influence into Spain, Carthage watched with clenched teeth. Hannibal, now a man, responded with fire. He crossed the Ebro River, and in doing so, crossed into legend. What followed was no ordinary war. It was a thunderclap stretched across years, the Second Punic War. Hannibal did not sail to Rome. He walked, with elephants, with mercenaries, with resolve colder than alpine snow. He led his army through Gaul, over the Alps, losing half to frost, avalanche, and starvation. But what remained was fire. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, he shattered Roman armies with elegance and brutality. Cannae, especially, rang like a funeral bell. Tens of thousands dead. The Senate grieved, but did not collapse. Rome, in ruin, still refused surrender. While Hannibal roamed Italy, Rome adapted. She appointed Fabius Maximus, whose strategy of delay, avoiding direct conflict seemed cowardly at first, but it worked. Hannibal could win battles, But not the war. He had no reinforcements. He had no siege. And so Rome, battered but breathing, struck back not at him, but at Carthage. Scipio Africanus, young and daring, took the fight to Spain, then across the sea. At Zama, on North African soil, Rome broke Carthage. Hannibal, defeated, fled into exile. Carthage survived, but only just. Rome imposed peace with weight and finality. Still, it wasn't enough. Carthage's walls stood, her ships traded again, and in Rome, old memories became new fears. Cato the Elder ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same line, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. And so, like a slow-moving storm, the Third Punic War gathered. It was less a war than a sentence. Rome returned, not to negotiate, but to erase. They laid siege for 3 years. They starved the city. When they entered, they found desperate resistance, but it could not stop fate. Carthage burned. Her people were slaughtered or enslaved. Her fields were salted, or so the legend says. And with her fall, the Mediterranean became a Roman lake. Yet something was lost. Too, not tactically, but spiritually. Rome, now unopposed, had crossed into a new world. She no longer fought for survival, but for supremacy. The wars against Carthage had forged her strength and revealed her hunger. Soldiers returned home with stories of elephants, of gold, of foreign gods and strange spices. They also returned with spoils, slaves, and ambition. The Senate, once austere, now glittered with wealth. The gap between rich and poor widened. The farms of veterans, untended in their absence, were bought by the wealthy, turned into estates worked by slave hands. The city swelled with displaced citizens, crowding into tenements, hungry for bread and purpose. The grain dole began a gesture of control as much as kindness. Gladiators bled for applause. Spectacles replaced stories. Rome had won the Punic Wars, but the peace that followed was full of shadows. Hannibal had long since died, pursued across kingdoms, finally taking poison rather than fall into Roman hands. His ghost lingered, though not in fear, but in memory. He had shown Rome its own limits. He had made her bleed, and for that, some even admired him. Carthage was gone, its walls dust, but in her absence, Rome found no satisfaction, only more questions, more horizons. The Republic had faced its greatest threat and triumphed, but the victory left a hollow, a silence too loud to ignore. And into that silence crept new ambitions, not from across the sea, but from within. Victory, once draped in laurel and silence, now walked hand in hand with gold. Rome had emerged from the Punic Wars not merely as a city triumphant, but as a power swollen by conquest, its fingers outstretched across the Mediterranean like the roots of an ancient oak. With each province came tribute, slaves, and silver, a river of wealth that flowed through the forum and pooled in the pockets of the powerful. But wealth does not distribute itself like rain. It gathers like smoke, curling into the high windows of the patricians, while the alleys below grow colder. The spoils of war that once bought civic pride began to deepen private greed. Villas replaced farms. The old Roman countryside, the backbone of the Republic, started to thin, replaced by vast estates run not by citizens, but by slaves. These slaves, captured from Gaul, Greece, Carthage, and beyond, were numerous, skilled, and voiceless. They tilled the land, built the walls, raised the children of their masters. Rome grew elegant and cruel in the same breath. The Senate, once a chamber of gray-haired statesmen guided by duty, became a theater of ambition. Men rose not by wisdom, but by wealth, and voices were measured not by honor, but by volume. In the streets, the people still gathered, still voted, still listened to speeches, but beneath the rituals, something darker stirred. Bread was no longer sustenance, but appeasement. Games once modest contests of strength turned into bloody exhibitions where men died for the amusement of crowds drunk on wine and heat. Gladiators became gods for an hour, then meat for the sand. The mob roared, and the Republic listened, not with empathy, but with calculation. A quiet rot spread through the city, slow, perfumed, and inevitable. The Gracchi brothers tried to stop it. Tiberius and Gaius, born of nobility but fueled by conscience, saw the imbalance, saw the farmers returning from war to find their land stolen, their families starving, their dignity hollowed out. They sought reform land redistribution, limits on wealth, grain laws to aid the poor. Their words stirred hope and fear in equal measure. The Senate bristled. Reform threatened profit, and profit had become the new altar. Tiberius was clubbed to death with a leg of a bench, his body thrown into the Tiber like refuse. A decade later, Gaius met a similar fate, pursued by mobs, abandoned by allies, and forced to die by his own slave's hand. The Republic had silenced them, but their deaths echoed louder than their laws. A new kind of Roman was rising, not the stoic farmer or the principled orator, but the populist, the general, the man who could command an army and a crowd. Marius was one of the first. He reformed the legions, opening the ranks to the poor, arming them with promise. Soldiers now fought not for Rome, but for their commander, for the share of plunder, for the dream of land, for the loyalty owed not to law, but to the man who paid them. Sulla followed cold, calculating, brilliant. He marched on Rome itself, a thing unthinkable just years before. The city trembled beneath the boots of its own defenders turned occupiers. Sulla named himself dictator, not for a moment, but for as long as he wished. Lists of enemies were posted, prescriptions, and men were killed not for crimes, but for their names, for their property. Heads lined the streets, and Rome learned to look away. When Sulla finally laid down power, it was not in shame but in satisfaction. He had proved that the Republic could be bent, broken, and still survive, at least in name. But names are fragile things. The young Julius Caesar watched all this with eyes that missed nothing. He came from noble stock, yet owed much to debt, charisma, and timing. He rose through the ranks with speeches spun like silk, with victories stitched across Gaul like embroidery on a general's cloak. He wrote of his campaigns in the third person, turning conquest into narrative, blood into legend. The Senate grew wary. He grew bolder, and when they ordered him to return without his army, he stood at the Rubicon, a shallow stream swollen with consequence, and he crossed. With that single act, the die was cast. Civil war followed, sharp and fast. Pompey, once an ally, now a rival, fell before Caesar's march. The Senate fled, returned, negotiated, and fell again. Rome's heart beat faster, erratic, uncertain. Caesar, now master of all, was named dictator for life. But even that was not enough. On the Ides of March, in the theater of Pompey, beneath a statue meant to honor the Republic, the knives came out. His assassins, believing they were saving the Republic, ensured its end. For Rome had changed. It no longer responded to the old words, liberty, tradition, res publica. It craved stability, and in the chaos that followed Caesar's death, it found it not in the Senate, but in his heir. Octavian later, Augustus watched the city unravel and gathered its threads into his quiet, careful hands. But before peace could be sown, more blood had to be spilled. The streets ran red during the Second Triumvirate. Prescriptions returned. Cicero, the voice of reason, fell to the sword. His hands, severed, were nailed to the rostrum from which he once spoke. Silence settled like dust. The Republic, once a chorus of competing voices, had become a stage for monologue. The dream of shared power faded beneath the weight of gold, ambition, and blood, and yet, Rome still stood grander than ever, and more haunted than ever. It began not with conquest, but with charm, a kind of soft, disarming light behind the eyes of a man who understood that power need not always shout. Julius Caesar entered Rome's stage not as a brute, but as a whisperer of dreams, of destiny, of Rome as it might be, molded not by tradition but by vision. He was handsome, eloquent, tireless. His debts were mountains, his friends powerful, his enemies calculating. Yet he moved through the corridors of the Republic like a man rearranging furniture in a house already burning. His early rise was swift, carried on speeches embroidered with myth, on alliances stitched in private rooms. He played the role of Pontifex Maximus with the solemnity of a poet and the cleverness of a chess player. He courted the masses with feasts, parades, grain not from compassion, but from strategy. The people loved him not because he was noble, but because he spoke to them in the language of spectacle. But Caesar was not content to glow in Rome's limelight. He wanted Gaul wild, vast, unconquered, and with it, he wanted glory, and so he went. And Rome, for a while, forgot. While senators bickered and coins changed hands in the forum, Caesar carved his legend into the mud and blood of foreign soil. The Gallic Wars were more than campaigns. They were a performance documented by Caesar himself in clean, crisp prose, each victory sculpted into the marble of collective imagination. He wrote not to inform, but to seduce. To read his words was to see a man who moved like destiny, who bent nature and tribe to his will, who crossed rivers in winter and faced chieftains like ghosts from myth. But it was not myth, it was murder. Towns burned, cultures collapsed, thousands died, and yet, back in Rome, the victories rang like music. Triumph followed triumph. Statues rose, coins bore his face, children were named for him, but with each laurel came a crack. For in his success, Caesar had outgrown the Republic. Pompey, once his partner in power, now stood against him wary, cornered, manipulated by a Senate that feared the general's return more than foreign invasion. And so the command came, lay down your arms, return to Rome as a citizen. Caesar paused, then crossed the Rubicon. A shallow river, insignificant to the gods, became a boundary between republic and empire, between hesitation and certainty. When his boot touched the opposite bank, the world shifted. Civil war followed like a storm that had waited too long to break. Cities changed hands like cards in a crooked game. Alliances shattered. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was killed not in battle, but as a favor to Caesar, a favor that disgusted him. He wept at the sight of Pompey's severed head, or so the story goes. But if he mourned, it was brief. He was now Rome's master, and the city bent to him not out of duty, but inevitability. The Senate named him dictator, at first for 10 years, then for life. He accepted with practiced modesty, wearing the role like a borrowed robe, but everyone could see it fit him perfectly. He rebuilt, he reformed, he planned. He filled the calendar with his name, drained swamps, filled granaries, passed laws. He forgave enemies, even as he watched them closely. He declined a crown 3 times in public. The people cheered his humility, unaware that it masked something older than ambition, a hunger to remake the world. But Rome was old. Rome remembered kings, and in the marble silence of the Senate House, knives were being whetted behind smiles. On the Ides of March, in the year of his new eternity, Caesar entered the theater of Pompey, unguarded. The day was ordinary, the sun gentle. He moved like a man above fear, but fear had not forgotten him. The conspirators waited, not with shouts, but with glances. The first strike was clumsy, the second sharper, then the frenzy began. 23 wounds, most symbolic. The last, perhaps, from Brutus, the man Caesar once called son. They say he covered his face with his robe, not out of fear, but dignity. The greatest man in Rome fell at the base of a statue of his old rival, and with him fell the illusion that the Republic could be reborn through death. For though the assassins had imagined themselves heroes, Rome did not rise to praise them. The streets did not fill with joy. The people did not cheer the end of tyranny. They mourned. They panicked. They remembered the bread, the games, the safety of knowing a single voice would answer when the storm came. And in that silence, another man stepped forward, not with fire, but with calculation. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, a boy of soft voice and sharper mind, read the will, claimed the legacy, promised justice. Beside him stood Mark Antony, fiery, theatrical, beloved. Together, they hunted the assassins, who fled east, hoping to wake the Republic in another place. But history does not run backwards. Philippi saw their deaths. The triumvirate formed. Prescriptions returned. Heads once noble rolled into baskets. And Rome, that eternal city, drifted further from the dream of shared rule. Julius Caesar, in death, became more powerful than in life. Comets streaked the sky. Statues wept dew. He was deified, not just remembered. Temples bore his name. The month of Quintilis became July, and the Republic, though still mentioned in laws, now lived only in ritual like a ghost, invited to dinner out of habit, not belief. Caesar had not merely crossed the Rubicon. He had crossed Rome's heart, changing it forever. He was not the first to seek total power, but he was the first to do it with a poet's grace and a politician's mirror. In him, Rome saw both its future and its funeral. He had not burned the Republic, he had exhausted it, replaced it with something new, something imperial, wrapped not in cruelty but in charm, in order, in the illusion of choice. The daylight of the Republic had faded, and in its place, twilight rose soft, glowing, dangerous. When the smoke of vengeance cleared and the last defenders of the old Republic fell silent beneath distant eastern skies, what remained was not chaos, but quiet. A strange, heavy quiet, the kind that comes after a long illness, when the fever breaks and the body forgets how to breathe without pain. Rome, exhausted from years of civil war, turned its weary eyes to the young man who now stood alone at its center. Octavian, not yet Augustus, not yet divine, but already more than a man. He spoke softly, with measured breath, as if the wrong word might stir the ghosts of Brutus, Cassius, Caesar. He did not declare himself king. No, that word was still poison in Roman mouths. Instead, he restored the Republic, or so he said. Power was returned to the Senate, magistrates appointed, elections held, but behind the curtain, the strings ran all through him. He was princeps, the first citizen, not a tyrant, not an emperor, and yet every decree passed because he allowed it. Every coin bore his face. Every law moved through his hand. Rome had found its master, and it called him savior. The wounds of civil war were still raw. Families had vanished in the purges. Names once spoken with pride were now whispered with regret. The people did not want more freedom. They wanted peace. And peace. Augustus offered like wine at a funeral, rich, red, and soothing. The Pax Romana began, not with conquest, but with stillness. Across the empire, roads were paved smoother, borders fortified, cities adorned, temples were rebuilt, not in new styles, but in the old, a conscious resurrection of Rome's earlier dignity. He cloaked change in tradition, innovation in memory. He did not erase the past. He embalmed it. The Senate still met. The Republic still lived in name, in ritual. In the marble facades of buildings he designed to look ancient. But the reality pulsed beneath the surface. Augustus held the army, the treasury, the gods. His image multiplied on statues, on altars, in the stories children heard as they fell asleep. Poets sang of him not just as ruler, but as destiny. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, casting Augustus as the endpoint of divine purpose, the heir to Aeneas, the one who would lead Rome into eternity. The past was rewritten to justify the present, and the people welcomed it, grateful for the calm. Under Augustus, Rome did not shrink. It grew not in desperate lunges, but in deliberate expansion. Egypt, once ruled by Cleopatra's eyes and Antony's dreams, now bowed to Roman law. The East was brought into clearer orbit. In the West, Spain was subdued. Its resistance quieted. Gaul was reorganized, not just conquered, but absorbed. And through it all, Augustus remained composed. He wore modest clothes, lived in a simple house, referred to himself with humility, but the symbols around him told a different story. The title Augustus, the Revered One, was not modest, nor was the cult that began to form around his person. In distant provinces, people lit incense before his image, prayed to him alongside Jupiter. The line between man and myth blurred, and he did not protest. He simply allowed. His reign was long. Decades passed under his hand, and for many, no other world existed. Children were born, grew tall, and enlisted in legions, never knowing a time before him. His reforms ran deep: taxation, administration, infrastructure. He created a system not for himself, but for continuity. He knew he would die, but he wanted Rome to remain. And yet, beneath the gold, there were cracks. Succession, that eternal riddle, haunted him. He had no son. He adopted, readopted, positioned heirs who died or disappointed. The deaths of Marcellus, of Gaius and Lucius, of Agrippa, each a step further into uncertainty. At last, Tiberius was chosen, reluctantly, a soldier, not a statesman, a man bred in shadows, not applause. Still, Augustus prepared the path. He staged the transition not as rupture, but as legacy. Rome must never again feel the tremble of civil war. And so, when death came gentle, after a long life, it found him ready. His final words, perhaps rehearsed, "Did I play my part well?" and the curtain fell. But what he built did not fall. The Principate, this delicate illusion of republic-veiling autocracy, held. His body was laid to rest in a mausoleum built for memory, and his name became divine. Augustus, the first emperor, though never called so in life, was now a god. His era, a golden age, or so the poets claimed. In truth, it was a time of tension beneath calm, of order enforced with quiet fear. But the streets were safe, the aqueducts flowed, the empire breathed in one rhythm, and the people, remembering chaos, chose stillness. He had given Rome a new shape, one that would last for centuries, echoed in marble and myth, not because he was the most brutal, but because he understood that power wears many masks. Augustus wore his mask gently, gracefully, gilded in nostalgia and restraint, and in doing so, he taught every ruler after him the art of pretending not to rule. It was said that Augustus found Rome brick and left it marble, and though the phrase echoed like flattery in polished halls, it carried truth. The city had changed. What was once a sprawl of crumbling stone, crooked alleys, and open drains had transformed into a vision of order and grandeur, chiseled from ambition and clad in permanence. Temples rose like mountains in the cityscape, their columns whispering of Greece, their altars heavy with sacrifice and incense. Marble lions crouched beside stairways, porticos wrapped around forms like folded arms. Even the gods seemed to sit taller in their shrines, not because they had grown, but because their houses now gleamed. Rome had learned to build not just for function, but for immortality. In the capital, stone was no longer a material, it was a language, a promise, a gesture toward forever. The Pantheon, with its perfect dome, didn't shout its magnificence. It waited, silent, serene, a temple to all gods, its oculus open to the sky like the city's patient eye, watching eternity unfold. Around it, the streets pulsed with citizens who lived in the shadow of greatness, and sometimes in its wake. The poor still crowded into tenements 5 stories high, with wooden balconies that creaked in the wind, and laundry that fluttered like banners of resilience. The rich lived lower, in atrium homes, cool with mosaics, and inner courtyards that caught the sun just so. Water flowed into fountains and cisterns from aqueducts that stretched across hills like veins across the back of a sleeping god. These were not the Rome of Romulus or even of the Republic. This was something else, a city as stage, as symbol, as center. And yet, in the temples where Vestals kept eternal flame and priests led goats to slaughter, something began to dim. The gods, once lively and feared, grew silent, not gone, not yet, but quieter, like old stories half remembered. Jupiter still reigned atop his Capitoline hill, but fewer hearts trembled at his name. The rituals continued, but often with a sense of duty rather than devotion. Offerings were given, auguries read, festivals held, but beneath it all lay a hollowness, a sense that the divine was drifting. The empire itself seemed to mirror this. It stretched wider now, from Britain's mist to Egypt's sun, from Iberia's coast to the deserts of Arabia. Legionnaires patrolled borders that their grandfathers had never known existed. In new cities like Timgad and Londinium, Roman order was stamped onto foreign soil like a seal pressed into wax. Baths, forums, theaters, All the bones of civilization were laid down with care, repeating the shape of Rome in distant lands. Yet, in this repetition, something changed. The further one traveled from the Tiber, the more Rome became an idea rather than a memory. In Gaul, soldiers prayed to Mercury before marching. In Syria, Jupiter blended with Baal. In Egypt, Augustus was worshipped beside Isis. Rome did not demand erasure. It allowed absorption. Cultures were not annihilated, but reframed. The gods slept. Yes, but they slept beneath many names, many faces, and in that sleep, they endured. Life in the empire was both grand and grinding. For the elite, it was a season of abundance banquets with silvered platters, recitations of epic verse, villas overlooking sea foam. Their wealth poured from mines, from taxes, from the labor of others. Their children were taught by Greek tutors, their ancestors praised in marble tombs. For the poor, life was more fragile. They lived in shadow of monuments, of policies, of power. They toiled in shops, on farms, in kitchens and quarries. But they too believed in Rome. The city was a mirror. In its greatness, they saw their place, even if small. The bread dole fed them, the games entertained them, the baths welcomed them. To be Roman, even on the margins, was to belong to something enormous. The legions were the thread that stitched it all together. Stationed across frontiers, they built roads, guarded trade, enforced law. They planted vineyards, married locals, and when they retired, they settled into the land they once subdued. Each soldier carried a piece of Rome in his armor, in his discipline, in his silence. They were not just warriors, they were the messengers of order. But order has its limits. Rebellions flared in Judea, in Germania, in Britannia. Not every people bowed to statues and senate. The empire answered with fire, then rebuilt with stone. It was a cycle, accepted, even expected. The cities, however, were its greatest pride. Alexandria, Ephesus, Antioch. These were not outposts, but stars in the Roman constellation. Their libraries, their amphitheaters, their markets bustled with citizens who, though far from Rome, thought in her patterns. Latin mingled with local tongues. Roman law adjudicated foreign disputes. And still, the temples stood everywhere, always their steps worn smooth by the prayers of thousands. But in some places, different prayers began to rise, not to Jupiter or Mars, but to new names, foreign, soft, persistent. Whispers of salvation, of one God, not many. A carpenter's son, executed in a dusty province, had become a name spoken in secret. His followers grew. They met in catacombs, in homes, in markets. They did not worship in temples. They shared bread and silence. Rome noticed, but slowly, there had always been cults, prophets, oddities. Most faded, but this one did not yet. For now, the old gods still slept on their golden beds, their marble eyes watching nothing. And Rome, beautiful and vast, dreamed on with them, unaware that its temples would one day crack, that the Pantheon would one day weep. For the moment, the stones still shone, the statues still stood, the city, the empire was alive, a heartbeat of arches and colonnades, of incense and applause, of dust and memory. And though the divine had grown quiet, Rome itself had become something sacred, not in belief, but in scale. A sacredness built not of faith, but of awe. The gods might sleep, but Rome, for now, remained wide awake. They came one by one, sometimes in silence, sometimes in thunder, wearing the robes of power that Augustus had stitched together with patience and illusion. The emperors, each crowned not with diadems, but with inherited expectation, slipped into a role that was no longer a function, but a myth. Some played it with grace, others with madness. But all of them, once robed in the purple, entered a world that no longer belonged to men, it belonged to shadows. Tiberius, cautious and reluctant, ruled from afar. He withdrew to Capri, cloaked in rumor and solitude, letting Rome run like a machine whose gears he only occasionally oiled. To the Senate, he sent letters, To the people, silence. Yet, under his stillness, fear pooled. The treason trials began slow at first, then quickening. Accusation became currency. Whispers became weapons. Rome held its breath as the walls of power thickened, and the air inside grew cold. Then came Caligula. With eyes that glittered too brightly, he danced across the stage of empire like a flame burning rules, names, and even gods. He made his horse a priest, perhaps a consul. He spoke to the moon. He demanded worship, whether mad or merely cruel. It made little difference. His reign was short, but Rome felt each moment like a fever. When he fell, assassinated by his own guard, the city did not mourn. It exhaled. Claudius followed, stammering, limping, overlooked yet under him. Rome advanced. He conquered Britain, reformed laws, built aqueducts. He married poorly, trusted unwisely, and was likely poisoned by his final wife. Nero came next. The artist, the actor, the arsonist. Some claimed he played the lyre while Rome burned, though whether he caused the flames or simply failed to quell them remains unclear. He raced chariots in the palace gardens, sang in theaters packed by fear, and ruled with a blend of delusion and elegance. He killed his mother, killed his wife, killed his tutor, but he built, too, the Domus Aurea, a golden house for himself alone, sprawling across the land like a dream without limits. The people starved. The Senate seethed. Eventually, even the legions turned. Nero fled, and alone in a villa, trembling and abandoned, he drove a blade into his throat. "What an artist dies in me," he whispered, and Rome turned the page. The year of the 4 emperors followed chaos incarnate: Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian. It was a year of marching legions and spilled blood, of loyalty bought and sold. But Vespasian endured, a builder by instinct, a soldier by career. He restored order not through spectacle, but through cement. He drained the treasury, then rebuilt it with taxes and patience. He began the Colosseum not for the gods, but for the people, a monument to control and distraction. Titus, his son, carried on his name, though briefly. He opened the Colosseum with games that killed thousands for entertainment. He watched Vesuvius bury Pompeii. He died young. Then came Domitian, the final Flavian, sharp, stern, paranoid. He called himself master and god. The Senate hated him. The army loved him. He built, punished, glorified, and finally was murdered in his own palace. So it went. Emperors rose, ruled, fell, some by natural death, most by sword or poison. Nerva brought a breath of reform. Trajan, his adopted heir, brought war glorious and endless. Under Trajan, Rome reached its widest borders, stretching like a lion at full length. His columns spiraled with carvings of conquest. His name became legend. Then Hadrian, the builder of walls, traveler of provinces, lover of Greek art and order. He walked the empire's roads, inspecting, refining, reigning in the expansion Trajan had unleashed. He built the wall in Britain, not to conquer, but to define. He restored temples, patronized philosophy, wept openly for his lost companion Antinous, whose image he raised to divine. Then Antoninus Pius, a long peace, gentle and dull. Rome exhaled again. Finally came Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, who wrote meditations in tents while fighting wars on the Danube. He ruled with thought, with sorrow, with weight. He tried to hold the world in balance, but when he died, he left the empire to his son, and the illusion cracked. Commodus ruled not with thought, but ego. He fought in the arena, dressed as Hercules, named the months after himself. His reign marked the shift from order to indulgence. He was killed, of course, like so many. And as the 2nd century faded into the 3rd, Rome's golden thread began to fray. Civil wars returned. Generals made themselves emperors. Armies chose rulers with the sword's tip. The city itself became background. The real power lay in the camps, on the frontier, where loyalty could be bought and held by fear. But the robe remained. Each new emperor wrapped himself in its folds, hoping to conjure legitimacy, to echo Augustus, to remind the people that Rome still lived. And in a way, it did. The building still stood, the laws still functioned, the games still played. But something vital had shifted. The emperors no longer ruled from the center. They ran to the edges, trying to hold back tides of invasion, rebellion, and time. Yet each man who slipped into the purple knew for however long it lasted, he was Rome. And that knowledge, whether it bred wisdom or madness, never failed to leave its mark. The robe remained silken, but beneath it, the skin of empire began to bruise. In the heart of the empire, beneath the domes and arches, beneath the creaking wheels of merchant carts and the soft scuff of sandals on marble, Rome had learned to distract herself from the tremble beneath her feet. It was not ignorance. Rome had never been ignorant, but a calculated forgetting, a ritualized looking away. As the emperors rose and fell, as distant legions bled into foreign soil, the people turned inward, toward the Colosseum, toward the circus, toward the warmth of bread pressed into their hands each morning. The grain dole, once a symbol of generosity, had become necessity, a tether between the stomach and the state. The people no longer followed politics as they once had. The republic was a word carved in stone, not a living thing. What mattered now was whether the grain ships from Egypt arrived on time, whether the chariots would race in the Circus Maximus, whether the games would be long and bloody, and they always were. The emperors knew this. They felt the breath of the crowd as they stood in their balconies, raising a thumb, lowering it, becoming divine for a moment in the roar. Gladiators fought not as prisoners alone, but as performers trained, branded, celebrated, sometimes even adored. They had names chanted like songs. They lived in barracks built for spectacle. Some survived long enough to buy freedom. Others died beautifully. The arena sand drank deeply, over and over, and the people watched with mouths half open, chewing olives and figs, hearts stirred by violence wrapped in ritual. Beyond the games, festivals filled the calendar. Saturnalia turned Rome upside down. Slaves dined like kings. Masters served with grins. There was laughter, wine, music, and masks. The lines blurred, and beneath all the celebration, time passed unnoticed, quietly hollowing the foundations. The cities grew, but not always upward. The old families shrank. The Senate, once a furnace of thought and governance, became a shell. Senators wore togas, delivered speeches, voted on edicts they didn't write. Real power lived elsewhere, in palaces, in camps, in whispers. Yet the forms remained. Rome loved its forms. It worshipped its continuity, even when the substance inside those forms had melted away. The people, too, adapted. They found joy where they could, in market gossip, in shared wine, in the smell of fresh bread and the sound of distant flutes. Children played among ruins already ancient in their time. Artists painted, sculptors carved, poets sang. There was still beauty, but beneath it all ran the knowledge that the world was changing. Foreigners now filled the ranks of the legions: Illyrians, Thracians, Syrians, men who fought not for Rome as an idea, but for coin, for land, for the promise of citizenship. Loyalty was no longer born in the forum, but bought on the frontier. Emperors no longer felt safe in Rome. Many lived elsewhere, in Trier, in Nicomedia, in Milan. They traveled constantly, chasing threats, chasing order, and when they returned, it was often only to die. Assassination had become a rhythm, a soldier's blade, a chamberlain's nod, a final gasp in a darkened hallway. This was how many reigns ended now. Yet, even in this uncertainty, Rome endured. The empire had grown too vast to fall in a day. Its body was immense roads stretching like sinews, aqueducts like arteries, cities like organs, and the heart still beat. Traders moved goods from one end to another: olive oil, glass, silk, wine, papyrus. Latin and Greek flowed through markets like currency. Law still ruled, at least in form. If a man stole a loaf of bread, he could still stand trial. The rituals still happened. The Vestal virgins tended their fire. The augurs read the flight of birds. The pontiffs made their sacrifices, but the gods, once woven into every moment, now seemed distant, like old friends who no longer wrote. In some quarters, new voices rose. Small groups gathered in shadows, speaking of one God, not many. A God who did not live in stone, who did not demand blood, but who promised life beyond death. The Christians had once been ignored, then mocked, then blamed Nero. It was said, lit his gardens with their bodies, but they didn't vanish. They grew, quietly, patiently. The old gods, majestic and unmoving, couldn't compete with the intimacy of this new faith. Not yet, but the whisper was growing louder, and still, Rome danced in her forums and her theaters, laughed in her streets, argued in her baths. Senators still debated, slaves still whispered, lovers still met beneath moonlit porticos. The city remained vibrant, even in its decay. Decay not as death, but as transformation. The marble cracked, the paint faded, but the soul lingered. The dream still shimmered in the minds of those who walked the Via Appia or watched the Tiber glint beneath the sun. Even as enemies gathered at the borders, even as the fabric frayed, there was a sense that Rome was not just a place, but a condition, a way of being. To be Roman was not to live in the city, but to live in its wake. And so the bread was baked, the spectacles performed, and the shadows lengthened. Rome, grand and weary, looked not ahead, but inward, cradling its myths like a mother clinging to her sleeping child. Beyond the soft glow of the Colosseum and the murmured prayers beneath Roman domes, there stretched a line, invisible but real, where order dissolved into mist, and mist into forest. To the north, past the Alps and beyond the Rhine and Danube, the world darkened. It was not evil, but untamed, cold, wide, unknowable. The Germans lived there not as a single people, but as rivers of tribes, drifting and reforming like the smoke of their fires. To Romans, they were barbarians, not for their savagery, but for their refusal to become mirrors. They did not worship Jupiter. They did not write laws in Latin. They did not want amphitheaters or aqueducts. They wanted to be left alone, and Rome could not allow it. For an empire that had made a religion of expansion, the edge was not a boundary, it was an insult. And so the legions were sent column after column of ironclad order, marching in rhythm, building forts as they advanced. They cleared forests, cut roads, marked territory with the unblinking eye of the eagle, but the land did not bend. In the forests of Teutoburg, under a sky thick with rain and uncertainty, 3 Roman legions vanished, not scattered, not defeated, destroyed, ambushed by those they called allies, led by a man they had trusted, Arminius, Roman trained, now turned rebel. It was not just a defeat, it was a memory carved in bone. The empire shuddered. Augustus, upon hearing the news, walked his halls in silence, whispering, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." They never returned, the banners lost, the standards buried in mud, and from that point onward, Rome hesitated. The forests of Germania remained unconquered, and the Rhine became more than a river. It became a line in the soul. Emperors tried again. Some made gains, but the price was always blood. The North did not forget, and neither did Rome. Yet the world was changing in ways that no wall could stop. Tribes were moving not in rage, but in pressure. Climate shifted, populations swelled, new threats pushed from the east. And so the Goths, the Vandals, the Alans, the Franks all began to stir. Not armies, but families, wagons, herds, children wrapped in furs, walking alongside elders whose eyes had seen nothing but sky. They didn't come to burn Rome. They came to breathe. And Rome, stretched thin, began to yield not at once, but like ice under slow sun. The frontiers buckled, governors pleaded for more men, more grain, more gold. The empire responded as it could, but the coffers were drained, and loyalty bought too often with promises instead of coin. Soldiers turned to looting, generals turned to ambition, usurpers crowned themselves in provincial capitals, armies marched against each other more often than against invaders. And all the while, the northern winds blew colder. Refugees arrived at the gates, whole peoples asking not for war, but for entry. Some emperors let them in, others turned them away. But once the gates opened, they never closed again. Rome had always absorbed. It was her genius. But now, the absorption came with desperation. Barbarians were enlisted into the legions, given land, given titles. Roman children learned Gothic words. Temples saw new gods, not Jupiter or Mars, but Christ. His cross now, a banner carried beside the eagle. Constantine, years before, had moved the center east, founding a second Rome in Byzantium, naming it Constantinople. There, the empire gleamed cleaner, stronger, newer. In the west, things began to rot quietly. Roads went unrepaired, walls crumbled, villas were abandoned, their mosaics left to collect leaves in silence. But still, the city stood. Rome remained a jewel, even if tarnished. The Senate still met, though it passed no laws. The people still gathered in the circus. But when Alaric came, the Visigoth king, once a Roman general, he was not driven by hatred. He wanted land, justice, a place for his people. He was denied. And so, in 410, he entered the city not like a thief, but like an answer. Rome was sacked. For 3 days, the eternal city groaned under foreign hands. Churches were spared, but homes were stripped, treasures taken. The world watched in disbelief. Rome, once the unshakable center, had been touched by fire, yet it did not fall. Not completely. It limped forward, a century more. But the barbarians did not relent. They were not invaders in the old sense. They were a tide rising, receding, returning. They didn't want to destroy Rome. They wanted to become it, even as they chipped away at its core. And Rome, exhausted, let them. Emperors became puppets. The real power lay in generals, often of non-Roman blood. One by one, provinces fell. Britain was abandoned. Gaul fractured. Africa lost. In 476, the Western emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. Not murdered, just set aside. No great battle, no epic final stand, just a door closing. The last emperor of the West faded into obscurity, and with him, the Roman sun slipped behind the northern hills, but the empire didn't vanish. In the east, it thrived. Constantinople stood tall, its domes gleaming, its walls unbreached. Greek replaced Latin. Emperors still wore purple. Senators still debated. Rome had not ended. It had moved. And yet, in the hearts of those who walked among the ruins of the western city, who watched weeds grow through marble cracks, there was a knowing. The Rome that once ruled the known world, that shaped thought, law, architecture, language, that Rome had been touched by winter, and in the forest to the north, where the snow fell thick and the trees grew tall, and the gods still whispered in forgotten tongues. The memory of the eagle flickered like fire in the distance, fading, but not yet gone. It began like most things in Rome quietly, not with rebellion, not with swords drawn in rage, but with necessity, paperwork, and tired pragmatism. The empire had grown too vast, its limbs too distant from the heart. Administrating provinces that stretched from the moors of Britannia to the sands of Arabia, from the cold banks of the Rhine to the crowded markets of Alexandria, required more than just legates and letters. It required division. Diocletian, a man of soldier's discipline and meticulous order, saw this. He was not born in Rome, and perhaps that gave him the clarity to see that it no longer needed to be the only sun in the sky. In 205, he split the empire in two, a practical solution, not a final fracture. East and West, each ruled by an emperor, each supported by a junior colleague. The Tetrarchy. He called it 4 rulers to stabilize the world. It was genius and unnatural. Rome had always preferred unity, even when it pretended to share. But Diocletian was not building a dream. He was building a system. The East, richer and more urban, hummed with commerce and bureaucracy. Greek was spoken more often than Latin. Cities were older, temples larger, tax systems smoother. In the West, Rome still held prestige, but its cities were scattered, its roads worn thin, There was strength, but also fatigue. The people clung more fiercely to tradition, to ceremony, to the fading rhythms of a time that no longer fully breathed. And so, like two brothers raised together but choosing different paths, the halves of the empire began to drift. The East found stability in Constantinople, that new Rome on the Bosporus, founded by Constantine the Great, its walls towering, its palaces clean, built where Asia met Europe. It was both fortress and beacon, blending old Roman pride with Eastern poise. The West, meanwhile, shifted uneasily. Milan, Trier, Ravenna capitals moved like leaves in wind, seeking safety. The city of Rome, once the beating heart of the world, became ceremonial, a museum of memories. The emperors no longer ruled from there. They visited, honored it, but ruled from elsewhere. Yet the split was not just geography, it was also spiritual. Constantine, the same emperor who secured the East, embraced Christianity not in whispers, but in policy. The Edict of Milan legalized the once persecuted faith. Bishops were summoned to councils, churches were built beside temples, and though the gods of old were not yet abandoned, their altars felt colder. The East embraced this change more quickly. It had long known religious diversity, long lived with mystics, sects, and syncretic gods. Christianity found fertile ground in Alexandria's schools, in Antioch's streets. In the scholarly rhythms of the East, the West struggled more. Its temples were tied to identity, to ancestry, to what it meant to be Roman. To abandon Jupiter felt like treason to history, but slowly, inevitably, the cross replaced the eagle, not in a battle, but in breath. And yet, for all this change, the unity held for a time. Emperors still claimed dominion over the whole. Coins bore titles of universality. Laws were issued in the name of Rome. But the distance grew. When a crisis struck, an invasion, a famine, a heresy, each half responded according to its own rhythm. Coordination became courtesy, not expectation. The East, with its wealth and walls, weathered storms. The West, battered from every angle, began to crack. Germanic tribes pushed harder. Britannia was lost, not with a scream, but a shrug. The legions simply left, never to return. Gaul fractured. Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was seized. And in each loss, the West looked to the East for soldiers, for gold, for help. Sometimes it came. More often, it didn't. The Eastern emperors saw the Western world as drowning in its own weight, nostalgia without strategy. They fortified their borders, built up their cities, aligned with their churches. They prepared to endure. In 395, after the death of Theodosius I, the split became final. His sons ruled separately, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. There was no more pretense. Two empires, two courts, two fates, and so the thunder sounded, not as a crack, but as a low, rolling growl. In the distance, the sound of something enormous shifting its weight. The West declined visibly. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Some ruled for days. Others were puppets, propped up by generals with private agendas. The Senate, now more ritual than real, still debated, still prayed, still honored the old names. But it held no power. In the countryside, law faded. Local lords began to protect their own, raising militias, building walls. Rome had once unified the world. Now it watched as that world redrew itself. In the East, however, things were different. Constantinople thrived. Its ports bustled. Its libraries grew. The Hagia Sophia, though not yet built, was already imagined, a vision of heaven on earth. The Eastern emperors ruled with pomp, but also with purpose. Their court became complex, ceremonial, layered with ritual. Their army was professional, their laws codified. They didn't call themselves Byzantine. That name would come later, from scholars looking backward. They were Roman still, always, but they were something new, too sharper, subtler, more enduring. And so the empire became two, not in rebellion, but in necessity, not in rage, but in quiet. inevitable divergence, like a tree whose roots stretched too wide, splitting the trunk. Each half survived in its way. The west staggered, fell, remembered. The east stood tall, endured, evolved. But the echo of unity remained, in memory, in law, in stone. Even as the thunder faded, long before the last emperor fell, before the banners were torn and scattered to the winds, a quieter revolution had begun, not with swords or sieges, but with whispers in candlelit rooms, with fish carved on walls, with bread broken not for spectacle, but for remembrance. Christianity had crept into the empire like a weed through stone, soft, persistent, and impossible to uproot. At first it was dismissed, a curious offshoot of Judaism, confined to a handful of distant provinces, but it spread, not by conquest, but by suffering. Its earliest followers did not rule. They bled. They died in amphitheaters, torn apart by beasts to the cheers of those who mistook cruelty for strength. They were mocked, beaten, hunted, but never silenced. Their faith was not in temples or statues, but in a man who had died the death of a criminal and risen as God. This story, strange and scandalous, stirred something ancient and new in equal measure. In a world of many gods, the idea of one personal, forgiving, eternal, was both comforting and terrifying. Rome, with its pantheon of deities and its rituals woven into law, could not understand a God who forgave enemies, who spoke of humility, who blessed the meek. And so the persecutions began sporadic at first, then systemic. Under emperors like Decius and Diocletian, edicts were carved into stone demanding sacrifices to the old gods. Christians refused, and for that refusal, they died. But their deaths became seeds. Martyrdom turned them into legends. Their names were whispered across seas, written in hidden scrolls, remembered in the catacombs where the faithful gathered like roots in the dark. And then, suddenly, the storm ceased. Constantine, a soldier, a strategist, a man with an eye fixed not on dogma, but on destiny. He saw the cross not just as faith, but as force. In 312, on the eve of battle, he claimed to see a vision, a cross in the sky, and the words in hoc signo, vinces in this sign, conquer. He won, and the world tilted. The Edict of Milan followed, declaring religious tolerance across the empire. Christianity emerged from shadow and into sunlight. No longer a crime. It became a curiosity, then an institution. Bishops came forth from hiding. Churches were built beside forums. The faith of martyrs now stood shoulder to shoulder with senators. At first, the transformation was cautious. Constantine himself was baptized only on his deathbed, hedging his soul until the end, but the momentum was unstoppable. The Council of Nicaea, convened in 325, gathered bishops from across the empire to define the faith: one God, one Son, one creed. Heresies were named. Orthodoxy was carved. The Christian Church, once scattered and persecuted, now walked in the footprints of emperors. It did not replace Rome. It merged with it. The cross and the eagle did not wrestle, they entwined. Rome gave Christianity roads, language, administration, and gravitas. Christianity gave Rome a new soul. Temples to Jupiter stood empty. Statues were toppled or rededicated. Basilicas rose, grand and solemn. Saints replaced heroes. The Virgin replaced Venus. And Christ, gentle, crucified, victorious, stood at the center, not on horseback, but on a hill. His kingdom not of this world, and yet now inseparable from it. Not everyone welcomed the change. The old aristocracy clung to tradition. Philosophers grieved the loss of the ancient schools. Some rural areas Pagai resisted for centuries. From these pockets came the word paganist, country dweller, one who holds to the old ways. But even they, in time, were folded into the new order. Christianity did not merely conquer, it endured. It redefined power. Bishops became voices of cities, arbiters of law, guardians of charity. Rome, once ruled by senators and emperors, now listened to priests. The Pope, originally just the Bishop of Rome, began to carry more weight, not by declaration, but by default. When emperors failed, the church remained. When palaces crumbled, the altar stood. And all across the empire, in towns and fields, people crossed themselves not before marble gods, but before wooden crucifixes. The transformation was not just institutional, it was personal. Where once gods had been distant and plural, now God was close, intimate, moral, demanding. Life became a pilgrimage. Death became a doorway. Suffering, once a shame, became a means to grace. This shift reshaped everything. Art turned from myth to symbol halos. Loaves, lambs, keys, music softened, liturgy emerged. Time itself bent, restructured around Christ's birth, his death, his resurrection. Calendars realigned, festivals took on new names. Saturnalia became Christmas, spring festivals became Easter. The old rhythms did not vanish, they were baptized. Yet within this new clarity came conflict. Doctrines split, councils convened. Heretics were named, Arians, Nestorians, Donatists, each declared wrong, sometimes exiled, sometimes killed. Orthodoxy required boundaries, and Rome, even under the cross, still drew lines. The empire, for all its power, could no longer hold spiritual unity with politics alone. And when the West began to fall, the church did not fall with it. It adapted, it stepped forward. As emperors fled and generals rose, the bishops remained in their cities, offering grain, shelter, stability. In Rome itself, it was no longer the emperor who spoke for the people. It was the Pope. Leo XIV, when Attila the Hun approached, did not summon legions. He walked out to meet him not with weapons, but with words. And Attila turned away, whether by diplomacy or divine awe. The result was the same. The city was spared, and Leo, a bishop in robes, stood taller than generals in armor. This was the new Rome, not the Rome of conquest, but of conversion. The church became the thread that tied the ancient world to the medieval. As law dissolved, it preserved books. As cities emptied, it kept records. As memory faded, it sang hymns. It was no longer a guest in the empire. It was its heir. The eagle still appeared on coins. Latin still echoed in chambers. But beneath it all pulsed a different rhythm, the slow, solemn breath of incense and chant, of gospel and creed. The empire had changed. Not fallen, not yet, but changed utterly. Its heart no longer beat with the march of legions, but with the toll of bells. There was no moment, no shattering of pillars, no sudden black veil cast across the sky. Rome did not fall as a flame, but as a breath slowly exhaled, long, steady, quiet. The old world, so tightly built, so meticulously ordered, loosened itself one seam at a time, until the garment of empire no longer fit the body it once adorned. The fall was not an event, it was a condition. The West, brittle and weary, had been crumbling for generations. Its soil, once tilled by citizen farmers, was now scraped by slaves or abandoned altogether. Roads lay cracked, their stones robbed to build cottages and chicken coops. Villas, once vibrant with frescoes and poetry, stood roofless and ivy-clad. The aqueducts still stood in many places, proud bones of a dying giant, but water no longer flowed in every channel. And still, people lived, not in mourning, but in memory. They plowed where they could. They raised goats. They told stories of Caesars and senators to children who had never seen either. The Roman way became a whisper. In the cities, what remained of administration was piecemeal. Magistrates passed titles from father to son, but their authority reached only as far as their courtyard walls. Taxes were collected in kind bushels of grain, skins of oil if at all. The law, once written in bronze and read aloud in crowded forums, became whatever the local strongman declared it to be. Rome had once made provinces Roman. Now, the provinces were remaking Rome into themselves. In Gaul, in Hispania, in Britannia, the Latin tongue remained, but it bent and curled into dialects, losing cases, absorbing local cadence. The language that had once conquered the world was being reshaped by those who had never known Cicero, who had never heard a speech in the Senate, who had never walked the marble roads of the Forum. Latin lived on, but like Rome, it was no longer whole. The legions, once the edge of the imperial blade, had become shadows. Many were no longer Roman by birth. They spoke Gothic, Frankish, Pannonian. They had Roman standards, but followed local warlords. Some fought for pay, some for plunder, some simply because war was all they had ever known. And still, there was no catastrophe, no final trumpet. Instead, there were sighs. Provinces lost contact, edicts went unanswered. Appeals for aid were sent east and received only silence. The Eastern Empire, strong and stable behind the walls of Constantinople, looked westward with a mix of pity and relief. The West had become a burden, a haunted house of glories long past. In 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a boy emperor, crowned in ceremony but empty of command, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who had once served in Roman ranks. The moment was strange. There was no resistance, no battle in the streets. The Senate handed Odoacer a letter, asking the Eastern Emperor Zeno to accept him as ruler of Italy. Zeno agreed. The empire, at least in the West, was over. But even then, no one said so aloud. The idea of Rome lingered, like smoke after incense, like warmth in sheets long after the sleeper has gone. People still called themselves Romans. Kings of barbarian lands claimed to rule in the name of Rome. They mimicked Roman customs, minted Roman coins, baptized their heirs in Roman churches. They dressed their conquests in Roman words. The ghost of empire walked beside them, and in Rome itself, the city, not the state life carried on. Grass grew in the cracks of the Forum. The Senate, a relic of a forgotten era, still met in name. The popes, now the true power within the city's crumbling walls, guided pilgrims to saintly tombs and bartered with invading generals. They wore robes not of conquest, but of endurance. They knew Rome was no longer ruler of the world, but it was still its memory. The people adapted. In marketplaces, they sold not silks from the east, but rough wool and salted fish. Traders counted coins with crosses instead of eagles. Families gathered around hearths and told stories of Caesar and Christ in the same breath. The sacred and the secular had merged, not in theory, but in daily bread. The fall of Rome didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like waking from a long dream and stepping outside to find the seasons had changed. The empire had faded, but the sun still rose. Children still played. Lovers still kissed beneath crumbling arches. Time moved forward. In the east, the empire, the true continuation of Roman power, still thrived. Justinian would rise a generation later, reconquer parts of the west, codify Roman law into a crystal clarity that would echo for 1,000 years. Constantinople would become a lighthouse of civilization, shining long after the west went dark. But in the lands once held by Rome, a new world was being born, one not yet medieval, not yet modern, but somewhere in between. Kingdoms formed where provinces had stood. Churches rose where temples had fallen. The Roman calendar still marked the days. Roman law still guided courts. Roman engineering still held bridges above rivers that had forgotten the names of the legions that built them. The empire was dead, and yet it lived. In stone, in language, in law, in dream. Rome had fallen, but she had fallen the way a star does, collapsing inward, then scattering fragments across the sky. Long after the legions vanished, long after the consuls had ceased to walk their measured steps across the Forum, Rome remained not in strength, not in grandeur, but in memory, in myth, in a strange and aching persistence. The marble had yellowed. The great statues had lost noses, fingers, sometimes heads. The aqueducts, fractured in parts, still stretched across the hills like fossilized sinews of a beast that once breathed the rhythm of empire. Grass grew in the cracks of old roads. Ivy climbed the shattered walls. In the Senate House, where once Cicero had thundered and laws had carved the fate of nations, silence ruled. Yet, in this quiet, something else stirred, not the hum of power, but the rustle of ravens, black and patient, circling above the ruins like keepers of forgotten oaths. The city had become its own ghost, its grandeur folded inward, and yet, people still lived there, not senators or generals now, but tailors, monks, beggars, scribes. They lived in the shells of ancient greatness, in the shadows of colonnades, in the broken archways that led nowhere. Roman bricks were pulled from fallen temples to build humble homes. Columns, once lifted in honor of gods and emperors, now held up porches and sheep pens. The past had not disappeared. It had simply been repurposed. The people no longer prayed to Jupiter. They knelt before crucifixes, whispered Ave Marias beneath the same domes where Venus had once been praised. Rome's faith had changed its face, but not its fervor. Pilgrims came not to see Caesar's tomb, but to touch the bones of Peter, to weep in chapels built atop martyrdom. The church had become the city's soul. The Bishop of Rome, once a marginal figure in imperial theology, had grown into something more. The popes, robed in white, lived not in palaces of emperors, but in cloisters of purpose. They held no armies, yet their words traveled far. They negotiated with kings, sheltered the poor, blessed the dying. Rome had lost her empire, but gained a strange, quiet authority, one rooted not in might, but in sanctity. Yet even that sanctity was tested. The city, weakened and exposed, invited the greed of others. In 410 it had been Alaric. Later came Gaiseric, king of the Vandals, his ships slicing the seas like blades. He came not with reverence, but with plunder in his eyes. In 455 he entered Rome. The city was looted again, this time not burned, not razed, but stripped. Gold was taken from temples already hollow. Statues were broken, not out of rage, but necessity. What had once been priceless was now portable. And still, the city endured. After the Vandals came the Ostrogoths, led by Theodoric, a king who claimed the Roman name with surprising grace. He ruled from Ravenna, but he preserved what he could of Rome's legacy. He respected the Senate, preserved the laws, let the churches stand. For a time, the city breathed with cautious dignity, but dignity was no defense. In the 6th century, the East returned. Justinian, emperor of Byzantium, sought to reclaim the West, to restore the empire whole. His general, Belisarius, marched through Italy. Rome became a battlefield once more, not of ideals, but of attrition. The city was besieged, taken, retaken, starved, bled. Its people, already few, were reduced to shadows. The aqueducts were cut, the baths fell silent. The lights of Rome, never fully extinguished, dimmed, until only embers remained. Still, they refused to die. The city shrank, not just in stature, but in size. From 1 million souls at its height, Rome withered to tens of thousands. The hills once crowded with villas became pastures. Cattle grazed where senators once walked. The Colosseum, once the heart of spectacle, became a quarry, a fortress, a dream. But dreams have weight, and Rome's weight was felt even in ruin. Throughout the medieval world, to be Roman was to claim descent from greatness. Kings styled themselves as Caesars. Holy Roman emperors wore crowns not of gold, but of association. They came to Rome, kissed the Pope's ring, and were anointed with oil that smelled of old glories. They rode through streets that echoed not with cheers, but with memory, and memory can rule more fiercely than men. The popes understood this. They rebuilt where they could. Churches multiplied. Bell towers rose like fingers reaching for what was lost. The papal court became not just spiritual, but political. Treaties were written in Latin. The Vatican emerged not as a palace of conquest, but as a lighthouse of continuity. Within its libraries, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, preserving Virgil beside the Gospels, Cicero beside Augustine. Rome became a custodian of its own past, and in doing so, of the world's. Across the continent, cities fell and rose. Empires shifted, but Rome remained not as ruler, but as reference. Every stone told a story, every ruin held a lesson. Pilgrims, poets, and scholars came from the north, the east, the far corners of lands once unknown to the empire. They knelt, not to emperors, but to relics. They wandered the Forum like children in a dream, touching stones as if they might still be warm. The ravens still flew above, indifferent to theology or politics. They watched from the roofs of old basilicas, from broken pediments, from the shadows of ruined arches. They were not omens. They were witnesses. And what they witnessed was not the death of a city, but its transformation from capital to relic, from command to memory, from ruler of nations to keeper of time. Rome no longer marched, no longer conquered. She remembered, and in that memory, she became eternal, not by strength, not by law, but by endurance. The empire had died, but the city had outlived it. She still stood, wrapped in silence and story, cradled by hills that had watched her rise and fall, and rise again in 1,000 whispered ways. And always, in the stillness, the ravens circled, while the west fractured and faded. Across the shifting blue of the Bosporus, the flame of Rome burned on, not in imitation, but in evolution. Constantinople, the city that Constantine had founded upon the bones of Byzantium, became the true heir of the empire, not as a twin, but as a continuation made strange by time and distance. Here, the columns still stood tall, the aqueducts still flowed, and the emperor still wore the purple. But the Rome of the East spoke Greek, bowed to different saints, dreamed through different eyes. It called itself Roman Romaioi, but it looked eastward as often as west. Its empire, known in hindsight as Byzantine, never thought of itself that way. It was the Roman Empire, whole and breathing, reformed in the language of mosaics and incense. The streets of Constantinople echoed with markets and hymns, the clang of coins and the deep chant of liturgy. The city shimmered not with conquest, but with endurance. Its walls, triple-layered and ancient even in their youth, stood like guardians against time itself. When Rome in the west had opened her gates to Alaric, Constantinople had closed hers to siege after siege, surviving Huns, Avars, Slavs, Persians, Arabs. She was impregnable not by luck, but by design, a city shaped to withstand both armies and centuries. And within those walls, the imperial court continued elaborate, ceremonial, layered with meaning. The emperor was no longer merely a ruler. He was God's representative on earth, the axis between heaven and humanity, robed not only in silk but in sanctity. Bureaucrats buzzed in their offices like bees in a golden hive, administering provinces with meticulous care. Diplomacy became an art form. If Rome had once expanded by legions, Constantinople expanded by marriage, by trade, by whisper. Its strength lay not in brutal force, but in elegant resilience. And yet, there was steel beneath the silk. The Byzantine military was professional, disciplined, strategic. Its generals, trained not in glory but in survival, knew how to hold borders that could never be truly tamed. The Themes military districts, blending civilian life with garrison order, kept the countryside secure without bankrupting the state. Its navy, with the terrifying power of Greek fire, guarded the coast like a wrathful ghost of Poseidon. But it was not war that defined the Eastern Empire. It was vision. Justinian, emperor of the 6th century, became its clearest expression. His reign was filled with contradiction, cruelty, and justice, ambition and devastation. He reconquered parts of the West, sending his brilliant general Belisarius to reclaim Africa, Italy, and even the city of Rome, if only for a while. But it was not the battlefield that cemented his legacy. It was law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of centuries of Roman law, became the beating heart of legal thought for generations. Scholars would one day study it in medieval universities, in Renaissance courts, in Enlightenment salons. In his laws, Rome truly lived. And then there was Hagia Sophia, the great church, built under Justinian's command. Its dome rose above the city like the memory of heaven-made stone. When he walked into it for the first time, it said he whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." Within its walls, light moved like breath. Icons shimmered on walls that seemed to float. It was not a church alone. It was an idea that faith and empire could be one, that Rome could be reborn not through conquest, but through contemplation. But even empires of contemplation faced storms. The Byzantines fought not just with enemies without, but with demons within. Religious conflict tore through the fabric of society. The iconoclasm, a period where images were banned, smashed, denounced left scars deeper than invasion. Emperors and patriarchs clashed, monks were exiled, faith fractured, yet the empire, bloodied and battered, held on, and through each century, it reinvented itself. When the Arabs rose from the deserts, sweeping across the old Roman lands with a fire and scripture, Constantinople stood firm. The caliphates advanced to her walls twice, and twice were turned away. The empire shrank, yes, but it never disappeared. Instead, it became denser, wiser, more complex. The Byzantines learned to survive, to endure, not through dominance, but through adaptation. They traded with the Rus, converted the Slavs, brokered with the Bulgars. They created new alphabets, new liturgies, new connections. The light of Rome was no longer blinding. It was glowing, steady, persistent, a kind of sacred ember, and it cast its warmth far. When Charlemagne was crowned in the West as Emperor of the Romans, the Byzantines scoffed. To them, there was only one Roman Empire, and it stood on the shores of the Bosporus, even when territory was lost, even when civil wars broke out, even when emperors fell to plots or poison. The city remained. A second Rome, yes, but also the last, and yet, decline, as always, was slow. The Crusades came first welcomed, then feared. In 1204, it happened the unthinkable. Western Crusaders, called by faith but driven by greed, sacked Constantinople. They burned, they stole, they desecrated. The city that had withstood so many enemies fell to those who claimed to be its brothers. Icons were shattered, relics were stolen. The empire, already strained, cracked open. For a time, the Latins ruled, but Byzantium, like its mother before it, refused to die. In 1261, the Greeks reclaimed their city. The empire, smaller now, humbled, broken in places, yet still breathing, limped on for another 2 centuries. Its borders shrank, its power dwindled, but within its churches, candles still flickered, the chant still rose. The manuscripts were still copied by careful hands. Rome still lived there, not in conquest, but in continuity. And when the end came in 1453, it came like dusk. The Ottomans, young and fierce, stood at the gates. Constantinople, surrounded, outnumbered, yet proud, refused to beg. The final emperor, Constantine XIII, fought in the streets, blade in hand. He died, and the city fell. The last echo of Rome, the flame that had burned for over 1,000 years after the West had gone dark, was finally extinguished, or so it seemed. Yet in truth, the flame passed on. It flickered in the domes of Moscow, in the Latin grammar of scholars, in the laws of nations, in the dreams of artists and poets. Rome, both the city and the idea, had become immortal, not by empire, but by memory, and the Byzantines, guardians of that memory, had carried the torch further than anyone ever imagined. Even now, when the empire's gone, when the last crown has long since turned to dust, and the last Latin edict has faded beneath the layers of time, Rome lingers, not in dominance, not in power, but in the quiet architecture of the world's memory. She lives in arches that still bear the weight of modern cities, in laws whispered through the mouths of courts, in alphabets traced by the pens of children learning to write their first names. Rome is not only behind us, she is beneath us, like roots under soil, invisible but unyielding. Her presence has shifted from command to echo. Every capital raised in her image carries her ghost. Every cathedral that pierces the sky borrows from her domes. Every calendar that counts its months in Julian measure, every language that folds itself around Latin roots, bears her fingerprints. In every republic, her name still breathes in senates, in forums, in titles drawn from her tongue. The empire has ended, yet she has not vanished. She is sediment in civilization's bloodstream, dust woven into the pages of philosophy, religion, law, and war. Cities rise where her roads once ran, states form with the shadows of her structure, and in the imagination of poets and emperors alike, Rome is always more than it ever was, grander in memory, more perfect in absence. Even her ruins speak. Tourists walk beneath shattered pediments and fallen columns, snapping photographs where once orders stood. The Colosseum, broken yet eternal, swells with voices that no longer scream. The Pantheon, its oculus still open to the sky, bathes dust in golden light as if waiting for something to return. These places do not mourn. They remember. They watch. In the minds of those who built and those who destroyed, Rome has always been more than stone. She was a system, a vision, a theater of human potential and of its collapse. She held the best of the mind and the worst of ambition. She crowned philosophy and crucified truth. She welcomed the gods and then nailed them to wood. In her embrace, genius was born and innocence was lost. The emperors who ruled from her palaces saw themselves as gods. The slaves who died beneath her whips saw only sky, and yet both, in some strange way, belong to her. In death, she has become a mirror. Nations look to her and see what they wish: glory, warning, identity, collapse. Historians trace her arc as if it were a prophecy. Politicians quote her, citizens claim her, ideologues argue over her meaning, but Rome no longer responds. She has become silence, the kind that speaks more loudly than speech. Her ashes lie in museums and beneath churches, in the DNA of continents, and her voice, though no longer sung by marching legions, is heard whenever civilization tries to define itself. The idea of Rome is not limited to a people or a time. It is a question. What happens when power outgrows its purpose? When culture cannot contain ambition? When memory becomes monument? The Romans once believed they had tamed the world, that their order was the final note in the song of time. And yet time continued. The lands they ruled no longer bear their flag. The laws they wrote are now interpreted through new tongues. But still, in moments of reflection, we feel her gaze. When buildings curve like domes, when laws weigh liberty against order, when literature strains for clarity and permanence, Rome is near, not as ruler, but as rhythm. She is the story we return to when we forget our place, and the measure we compare ourselves to when we dream too large. The dream of Rome did not die in fire or famine. It slipped beneath the surface of the world and seeded new empires, new churches, new songs. Byzantium was her echo in the east, the papacy her priesthood in the west. The Renaissance was her resurrection in marble and ink. Even America, so new in history's terms, carries her Senate, her republic, her eagle. She never stopped breathing. She simply changed her name. In her last form, Rome was not an empire, but a legacy. Not a map, but a memory. And in memory, she grows. Every artist who sketches a colonnade, every student who recites Cicero, every pilgrim who kneels before Peter's bones, adds one more stone to her invisible city. She is a Rome without borders now, scattered across continents, spoken in the breath of lawyers, builders, priests, rebels, and dreamers. Her marble has cracked. Her eagles no longer fly, but in hearts and histories, she endures. Not as a queen, not as a god, but as the ghost that walks behind civilization, quiet, watching, never truly gone. And so now, we are left in the hush that follows a story fully told. The empire has passed, the banners are folded, the sandals have stopped echoing against stone. But in the silence, something lingers, not the clang of swords or the roar of crowds, but the faint warmth of memory. Like the dying light on an old wall at dusk. You have walked through centuries tonight, through dust and triumph, through marble and fire. You have seen emperors rise with gold in their eyes and fall with whispers in their ears. You have watched cities grow from huts into temples, from temples into shadows, and all along, the heart of Rome beat on slow, persistent, changing, remembering. Now the Forum sleeps. The columns stand, but no voices fill their space. The aqueducts rest beneath ivy. The old roads, once pressed with the feet of legionnaires, lie quiet beneath the stars. Time does not mourn. It flows. And Rome, for all her might and myth, has become part of that flow, not lost, but folded into every page that came after. Let yourself drift now. like a pilgrim leaving the gates of a city just before dawn. The hills dark, the sky wide. Feel the calm. The empire is no longer yours to carry. The maps have faded. The drums have stopped. There is nothing more to conquer. Only to rest. Only to remember. Only to sleep. The eternal city remains. Not in stone, but in you, in the way you listen. The way you wonder. The way you dream of the world that was. And the world still to come.